Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on compost makes good bedding. I'm just going to share my screen and so the Department of Planning, Industry and the Environment funded the project under the Waste Less Recycle More program funded by the Waste Levy. The program was in collaboration with Crestfield, the then EPA, ANL and MRA facilitated the program. I'd like to thank all of these participants. It's been a complicated and not one of the easiest programs to work with, but we've pulled it together and there's been some very positive results from the use of the material. I'll pass it over to Sol, who's going to talk about the trial and what we did. Sol?
Thank you, Virginia. Yes, it's been a fun and challenging project. So I'll just share my screen and get my presentation up and running. Okay. So, compost makes great bedding. The aim of this trial was to increase the use of recycled organics in the horse industry and to increase the awareness of the availability of quality recycled organics. The aims of this trial were centred around the objective of, through farm-based learning, demonstrate and communicate to the equine industry that horse bedding made from recycled organic material can be used as a practical, suitable and sustainable horse bedding material. So why have we conducted this trial? And why is there a need for a project like this? Recent significant investments in organics recovery facilities by the New South Wales government and private industry have resulted in the increased production of high quality compost from urban centres in the Hunter region. While there is a surplus of this material, market creation is required to form an outlet for these compost products. The equine industry offers significant, new and large volume markets for composts in the Hunter region and New South Wales more broadly. Traditional bedding solutions such as sawdust are also becoming harder and more expensive to source, thus creating a market opportunity for recycled organic material. I just want to provide a brief overview of the trial and how we structured it. So the trial used farm-based learning to increase the general understanding of recycled organics materials and as horse bedding. The host and trial participant, Crestfield Stud, agreed to take part in this trial. Crestfield is one of Australia's most prestigious breeders of thoroughbred mares, and they hosted the trial and provided access to equine networks and communication channels. Lisa will tell us a little bit more about Crestfield in just a minute. So, concurrent with the aims of this project, by increasing awareness, interactive workshops were set up to run on Crestfield Stud. 2 workshops were planned as part of the trial, each to be held on Crestfield Stud. Workshop 1, which was held on the 26th of February, was used to introduce the project, provide information about the general characteristics, benefits and uses of compost, and included a discussion which generated the key questions to be answered about the trial, or from the trial. These questions, based from the discussion, were used to build the criteria by which we monitored the performance of the material throughout the trial. Workshop 2, which is held today, due to COVID, we had to move it to an online forum, as many others have done. And we will reveal the results today and discuss how the material performed throughout the trial. So, Virginia, will you now invite Lisa Bowman to talk about Crestfield?
I'd like to welcome Liesl to the chair. She's the manager of Crestfield Stud. and she, she's going to talk about her involvement in the project and what Crisfield thought about the material. Thanks very much, Liesl.
Thanks, Virginia. Yeah, I just want to do a bit of an outline of what Crisfield is about, if I can. So that's a little picture of Crisfield, an aerial view, if you like. So we're on about 3,500 acres, so quite a large property. And we've been operating for about 20 years. We've sort of developed the farm specifically for thoroughbred breeding. So we've got about 30 commercial mares that we breed here every year, and we walk on to various stallions throughout the Hunter Valley. Now, so our production cycle is that we'll breed those commercial mares in September. We'll foal down the following August to November, and we'll wean foals the following January and April, and then again the following year we'll sell them as yearlings. So we're sort of looking at about 3 years from conception right through to sale for our production cycle of the horses. So during that production cycle there is a number of needs for bedding, I guess. Most of the time the horses live out in the paddock if they can. But on certain occasions, they're required to be stabled, and therefore they need a bedding for that. So those requirements to stable will be if they're injured or ill. For a yearling sales preparation, so for yearlings we have them in a stable environment for about 9 weeks leading into a auction sale. So that's a fairly intensive use of bedding. We'll also use stables and bedding if we're confining horses for certain procedures. So that might just be for a day here or there, or a couple of hours here and there. And the other major thing that we use bedding for is when we wean the foals from the mares. And in this case, that was what we trialled the bedding for that weaning procedure. Now, traditionally, the challenges for us for a bedding is we need something that absorbs moisture, we need something that's low dust, and we need something that's easy to clean, in that you could rake it flat, find the manure and pick it up quickly, and also something that's comfortable for the horses to lay on. And finally, with a lot of urine, the horses produce a lot of urine in the manure, it needed to sort of be able to cope with that odour and control that odour. So that's just a very brief overview on what we do, Virginia, just basically breeding those thoroughbreds to then sell them as yearlings to then go on to be racehorses. And throughout that production cycle, there is the need to use bedding in our stables for various procedures.
Thanks very much, Liesl. When we presented this project, we'd heard from the industry that there was various issues with sawdust. What do you think the issues are in terms of sawdust? I mean, and why we're recommending alternatives, or why we're looking for alternatives to sawdust?
Sure, I think some of the issues more recently have been that the supply of it's been harder to get hold of. So you're really having to, you have to order sawdust sort of some weeks in advance of needing it, which doesn't always fit in with how our business works. Sometimes you need it next week. So that doesn't necessarily work that well for us. Also, it's become more expensive. So it just adds to, to our cost that we have to carry as well.
Okay, so some of the parts of what we were trying to address in this was that compost, because there is now such an investment in recycled organics, that compost is readily available and it is becoming an affordable media. And I think the challenge for this project that I'll get Rob to address was looking at what characteristics we could formulate into this material so that it would at least match sawdust, if not surpass sawdust qualities. So I might throw to you, Rob, if you're ready to just chat about what your thoughts were in formulating a material as horse bedding.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so I'll just give a very quick overview of what the presentation will be. So it's a little bit about compost itself, a bit about the quality and standards, I guess a bit about the more traditional equestrian products been in the market, the trial products that we played with, and then our observations at the end and throughout the process. So in simple terms, I would say to anyone listening, there are a whole lot of different composts. So what you use is important, and the detail around the product is also important. So I guess ask the question. For a business like us, we've been involved in all sorts of different applications. This one is new to us, but compost isn't new to a very broad range of markets. So, you know, our business is almost 50 years old. There's a lot, maybe not that old, but certainly a lot that have been composting around the place. So these products shouldn't be new to most markets. In terms of qualities and standards, so the Australian standards, most players in our industry should be certified to one of the Australian standards. In our case, you'll see there's 3 different standards under that red logo. AS4454 is the compost standard, so that's really the one you've got to worry about. People might be NASA or BFA or some other organic certification, and they may well have some sort of management system. So that agreement on the right is an environmental management system certification. Different businesses will have different sort of certifications, or should. I guess the one thing I would say around that is you really need the comfort that people have control over their production. Whatever process they use and through whatever certification they carry, that is a sign to you that there is some sort of process control and quality control. In terms of the sort of products in the market, we've made a range over the years for stable beddings and arenas and service yards and racetrack fibres. Apologise for a couple of those images, which are a bit lousy. I would think most people in the equestrian field would be used to seeing one or more of all of those. Obviously, the sawdust on the left has been around for donkey's years and would be the most common. But there's a range of products being used, and they're not all organic. You know, there's a bunch of others around, but certainly for our business, we're very much in the sort of organic residues market. That's our industry, so that's the range of products that we manufacture and sell. In terms of the actual trial itself, and I guess Virginia or Sol will give other information, or Liz will give other information. For me, it was really around the physical, chemical and hydrological parameters that appeared to be of importance. And odour was mentioned early. For me, it was around its bulk density, its weight can be an issue. Oops. Hydraulic conductivity, which is essentially water flow or liquid movement through the profile, and I'll talk about that in a minute. That also links to compaction. Absorption, which is really, does it take up urine or feces, and how does it manage it? The next 3 are really parameters that came out of the potting mix standard. So I've used those because they relate to air and water and wettability, and although they're traditionally used in potting mixes, they're applicable here because they're the aspects of these products that potentially have benefit or disadvantage in the application. And the last one was odour, potentially odour management or generation or creation, if that was going to be the case. So we looked a bit at that. We compared our stable bedding with a couple of blends with compost in it. So it was really a bit of it was a big initial investigation, really to understand what was the impact of having compost in these blends. Are there disadvantages? If so, what they are, in terms of the main issues relating to a stable or horses strolling on them, and then are really trying to get a handle on were there likely to be obvious negatives as part of it. Now, I've less focused on the aesthetics of it, but aesthetics has also been raised as potentially an issue. This was more around its performance in terms of, I guess, urine management, and does it hold up as a product in the application. So in terms of what we observed, bulk density, which is basically weight per metre, it's tonnes per metre, across the different treatments or the different products, there wasn't really a great deal of difference. So you're running from 190 to 230 kilos a metre. So there's not really enough. I don't see bulk density or weight as being an issue. Hydraulic conductivity, which some people might not know. Sorry about the phone. So hydraulic conductivity is an analysis that's come out of the landscape soils standards. And what it's designed to do is give a guide to the likely changes in a product's conductivity of water under compaction. So what they do is they take the sample. So it's really used in sporting fields and things like that, like heavy use applications. And it's trying to give a guide as to over time, does the thing compact or not? Now, I've used 16 drops. In basic terms, what they do, they have a sample in a colander and they literally drop it 8, 16 and 32 times. I'd ask for the numbers at 16 drops, and it's a guide as to, when you've got horses moving on it, does the thing settle and does it compact? Now, the range of numbers that we got out of that, and you get results in millimetres per hour. So they drop the column, they then pour water in the top, and they measure how quickly or slowly it runs through the product. And then they drop it again. So they try and increase the amount of compaction or sort of mirror the compaction and give you a result after they've dropped it 16 times. Now, in this case, the range is 10,000 to 12,000 millimetres an hour. So basically it's saying in 1 hour, that liquid dropped in the top of that will travel 10 or 12 metres vertically. So if you had a 12-metre high pile, within an hour you'd see water come out of the bottom. Now in a turf sort of application, if you can get up to a couple of hundred, that's very good. So these numbers are very, very high, which is what you'd expect for the sort of material. So I think from that perspective, the results suggest that even though it does compact a little bit over time, it's not significant. So that number's good. In terms of absorption, we then looked at so AFP is air-filled porosity, so that's how much air is in the product. Again, the numbers range from 40 to 43%, so there's not a lot of difference between them. The water holding capacity is how much moisture the product will hold at saturation. Again, it increased when we added compost, and the more compost, the greater the water holding, which isn't surprising. But it wasn't as significant as I thought it might be. But I suppose, from 36 to 42, it's something like a 10 to 15% increase, which, is probably significant, but not as much as I thought it would be. In terms of the wettability, interestingly, the wettability increased. So the wettability is really just how long it takes for something to absorb the moisture. So the data around that was a bit messy, and keep in mind, there's not a huge data set for this. So it's little data. So drawing some, conclusions is fraught with danger. Be that as it may, though, the data suggested that the wettability increased with compost. Again, a little bit surprising, but that's what it showed. In terms of odour management, which was the last thing we looked at, it's hard to, when you look around, there's not particularly good work done in this area. So I had a conversation with the lab about how we might measure. So ammonia was the one that I thought was the most obvious one to try and pick up. So we looked at both pH, and we added the DL as dynamic lifter. So to get some sort of guide as to ammonia volatilization, which is the sort of the gasification, if you like, of ammonia, they used dynamic lifter as the component to add as a ammonia sort of additive, if you like, at 10, 20, 40 and 80 grams per litre. And they, pretty basic, they did a sniff test actually with the staff. So what came out of it, and the reason that pH is important is that as pH climbs, ammonification or volatilization or gasification of ammonia increases. So the pH increased across the blends by around about a full pH unit. So it went from around about 6 to a bit over 7, or 7 or 7 a bit. So it didn't become particularly alkaline. It was basically neutral. And the results showed that when you compared samples without compost and samples with compost, that there was a reduction in perceived odour. In this case, it was ammonia that they were looking for. Now, again, the data set's not massive here, but the suggestion is that the addition of compost will have a positive impact on odour, which probably makes sense because you've got microbial activity within the compost. The whole idea of microbes is that they grab things like nitrogen out of the soil or out of the air, so that probably doesn't make sense. And the other thing was that a 1 unit increase in pH from 6 to say 7 wasn't high enough to seriously impact the gasification of the ammonia. So you've got to get up more to 9, 10 or 11. So the pH change had no downside, and the addition of compost would appear to have a benefit in terms of odour management. So that's, in a nutshell, what we've looked for. I guess in summary, the weight wasn't an issue. It drains freely. There will be some increase in water holding. I think there's a benefit in wettability. In terms of the air-filled porosity, which is how loose and airy the product is, there wasn't really a significant change. But again, it's not 100% compost, so that probably doesn't, that makes sense. The odour management, I think, was interesting. Now, where all that sits in, the only other thing outside of that really gets into the aesthetics. And I believe, I think Sol or someone else or these others will talk about that. There are comments, people are used to seeing light product. Sawdust, I guess, predominantly in the market. So there will be downsides around the aesthetics, and whether that's a practical downside or just people aren't used to it, I guess is yet to be seen. I guess the one, so thank you, but the one comment I would make is the reality is broadly speaking, not only in New South Wales but across the country, organic residues, forest residues, if you like, barks and sawdust, they're diminishing, and the long-term prognosis for the availability of the products that have historically been used in equestrian applications, that's going to become a problem. And the supply is only going to get worse. In fact, it's gotten worse in the last week. So I think inevitably it's something that when I say that our industry and the equestrian industry is going to have to face at some stage, and I accept the costs and all the rest of it. But that's why projects like this have come about, to see what are the alternatives and how do you manage costs, because we're no different to an equestrian centre. Cost is also an issue for us.
Yeah.
So I think that's about it for me.
Yeah. It looks like that, increasing the proportion of compost in the mix had improvements on a whole range of factors. What, if any, do you think the limits to that compost blend, the proportions within the material, apart from perhaps aesthetics? Can you keep increasing the amount of compost in the blend and keep improving those factors?
I think I think it will depend exactly on what product is being used. We used a fairly fine one, and I would continue to use that, because you are looking for some absorption. You're looking for some water, some hydrological sort of parameters, and the fineness helps with that. Just how far you can go, that's a bit hard to say. I'm far more used to potting mixes. The finer you go, very quickly you close something up. So I would have thought I would have thought if you got upwards of 50% compost, I would think you would have considerable problems, I suspect. If you set aside the aesthetics, and the darkness at that point would probably also be an issue. But I think, to be honest, I don't know there's a lot that people can do about that. There just aren't the resources around for the price points that have historically been in the market. So, you know, the equestrian industry is not the only one that is having to get used to other alternatives that they don't, you know, they haven't used historically, and they don't necessarily like. I personally wouldn't go more than 50% compost, and I doubt that I would get to that. I don't think that product would hold up. I doubt it would hold up under a fair amount of use. Haven't done the work, but I would have some reservations on that. I suspect it would compact, and I suspect it would probably go a bit soggy.
Okay, well, that's really good insights. I might just get you to stop sharing your screen now, and we'll come back. Excellent, brilliant, thank you. Sol, do you want to walk through some of what we found out about how the material performed?
Sure, Virginia, and thanks, Rob. That was extremely insightful and detailed. Okay, so yeah, I'll just go on to talk more about the trial and how we set it up and progressed through this study, this trial. So the experimental design was built to test recycled organics in Crestfield's yards. So Crestfield contains 9 mesh yards. These semi-enclosed open air yards where they bring their foals or their mares in during their weaning season or at other times, as Lisa will explain. 4 of these mesh yards were filled with compost, or the recycled organic material, and it was kept in there for the duration of the weaning season, so from February through to May. In order to gauge or quantify the material performance, we used the criteria that we created from the discussions held in Workshop 1. The main criteria for the bedding success or performance were mucking, odour, dust, compaction, absorption, banking, and we added in any behavioural or issues or reactions from the horses, largely anecdotal, but they were important to kind of use that as a means to assess how the horses react to the material. So in terms of awareness monitoring, we surveyed the attendees to the first workshop, and we'll do that again today. So attendees to today's session will be emailed a survey after this webinar, where they'll be able to comment on the trial, the material, and the performance of the material throughout the trial. And we'll also gauge awareness monitoring through keeping track of sales and farm visits by the compost suppliers. So here's a schematic of Crestfield's mesh yards. You'll see the top 4 numbered 1 to 4 compost were the yards that were used for the trial, and sawdust remained in the other 5 yards. As I said, the yards are open air. They offer a good amount of sunlight and shade. And in the bottom is the scoring key that we use to assess the performance of the material. It was a scoring key of 1 to 5, 1 being the best, as in the recycled organic material worked better than sawdust, and that carried through all the way down to 5 being it was unmanageable, and the material had to be replaced in the middle of the trial with traditional methods. I'll just say here that didn't happen, which is already a positive result. So here's just a brief comparison of the product. Rob gave a detailed description earlier on it, and thank you. You'll see the fit for purpose recycled organics on the left, compared to the traditional sawdust on the right. And anecdotally, again, there's very little difference in appearance between the two, which is a positive. So in the first workshop, we presented the project to the participants. We introduced the project partners, and the supporters. We used the first workshop as a means to provide a context for the project. Why using compost in agricultural industries can be beneficial, the general benefits of compost. We supplied a summary of compost as bedding as horse bedding research. This included examples from Europe and the US. This past research largely provided the background for this trial. And as I said earlier, the first workshop was a platform where participants were able to discuss the use of recycled organics privately with the compost suppliers for trial on their own properties also. So we used the questions and discussion time in the first workshop to focus largely on how compost can be used as bedding and yard servicing, how long it can last, the risks associated with using it, or the risk management. And a key factor that was raised was that if there was any impacts on the horses, so in terms of behavioural changes or staining from the darker nature of the product. So the results from workshop 1 were used to develop the resources for this entire trial and monitor the results, considering all the factors addressed from the discussions. So I'll jump into the results. The number one, workability. Manure was removed or separated from the yards. And as you see in this graph, it performed consistently throughout the duration of the trial. It stayed at a consistent rating of good, number 2, working just as good as sawdust. As mentioned, odour is an important factor for horse bedding. It's important for horse hygiene. And we saw no change throughout the trial. It ranked it good, which means that through increased exposure to activity, this material managed to maintain an extremely high level of odour management. Dust was also an important factor. Dust can be an issue for horses in terms of creating infections or harbouring mites, pathogens, also creating eye irritations. But dust can also be an occupational health and safety hazard for workers when they're mucking or working in and around the yard. And so you can see from this graph that whilst dust started ranking high, it showed a little decrease over time. Still ranking at the end of the trial at a rank of 3, which is still quite manageable and workable. So Rob talked a lot about compaction and the tests involved that A&L put towards creating this product. And that level of research and testing has shone through in the trial itself, showing an improvement in compaction over time. So when compared to sawdust at the beginning of the trial, the material was slightly more dense and less compact. However, the varying particle sizes resulted in a longer lasting material performing better than sawdust at the end of the trial. You can see that rise in performance of the material. Absorption being a key factor, decreased slightly, but also not to a level that was difficult to work with or an issue for the Crestfield staff to manage throughout the time of the trial. So another key factor that was raised, that was noted in the first workshop was banking. Traditional sawdust tends to bank or ride up the sides of yards quite often, resulting in more work for the stud managers, trying to keep it level and trying to avoid the horses from digging too many holes in it. So banking performed the best out of all of the factors. It stayed level. It was lightweight to work with. And the horses could not push the material up the walls as easily as sawdust. So you'll see that it ranked at #1, being better than sawdust throughout the duration of the trial. So in terms of behavioural changes, we mentioned that staining could have been an issue, and that was one of the main concerns prior to the trial. We didn't see any significant changes to the horse's behaviour throughout the trial. There was no staining, no eye irritation, flies or mites or pathogens did not become an issue, and there was no sign of general irritation. There was one novel anecdotal observation, that was that horses did not lay down as frequently when they initially entered the yards. It's difficult to determine whether this behaviour was a result of the different bedding, as the material was only used for a short period of time. Further trials may result in greater insight into the horse's behavioural reactions to this recycled organics. So early last week, I did a little bit of an interview with Liesl in some of the yards to get her general feedback on the material and the trial. So we'll just go into that now.
Excellent. Liesl, we might just ask you those questions directly. What were your initial impressions of the material?
Well, I guess I was initially quite surprised. I'd sort of had these preconceived notions of what I thought it would be like. When you mentioned the word compost, just you immediately imagine that sort of really dark, heavy, lovely wet sort of stuff that you'd put on your garden. And I thought, well, this is not really going to work for stable bedding. But what arrived was sort of, because I guess it's that blend was something that was much, lighter in colour, was actually movable, had a bit more airiness about it. So I was really sort of, when the truck pulled in and dumped it on the ground for us, I was like, oh, actually this might work. I was very reserved about it initially, but pleasantly surprised when I saw the product arrive, and quite happy then to place it in the boxes and give it a whirl.
Yeah, cool.
Thanks for that, Liesl, and apologies for my my bandwidth at the moment. It's been problematic the last couple of days, to say the least. So how well could the recycled organics be mucked, Liesl?
Sure. Yeah, very easily, really. I thought initially that the dark colour, when I was expecting something very dark, may sort of prevent just visualising dark manure and being able to muck that out. I thought that would be one of the key problems. It turned out not to be. It was quite visible, quite easy to see and muck out. Keeping in mind that mucking out stables it chews up a lot of labour hours for us, so it takes up a lot of time. So anything that prolongs the period that it takes to muck out is always of a concern. So I was quite pleasantly surprised that it was easily to pick out the poo, and that it actually, once you pick it up on the rake, the bedding actually falls through. So you're not throwing out a heap of bedding when you're mucking out either, that you just need to isolate the manure and remove that and let the bedding fall back down. So I was happy that the particle sizes were small enough to allow that, and that, yes, that it was not too dark, and it was actually very easy to move. So it's not really cumbersome to pick up. Sometimes sawdust can get quite heavy, and by the end of a long day of mucking out, your staff can be, they can be wrecked from doing a number of boxes and moving all the sawdust around. So it was really quite a pleasant material to work with in that respect. Quite easy and significantly probably quite quick.
Sure, great. So could you give us a little bit more insight into any behavioural changes from the horses. As I mentioned, they didn't lay down.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably very subtle, I guess, and you'd have to, it's not something that I necessarily noticed myself, but some of the guys that were around the horses more often, quite often when you're putting a horse into a sawdust box for the first time, it's sort of like they rejoice a little bit, like they'll dig it up and they'll roll in it, like they really sort of enjoy the feeling on their back. So I'm wondering whether, and they don't always do that, but they didn't necessarily anecdotally do that with this bedding. In saying that, they didn't look morose by being kept in those stables either. They didn't look like they were they were sad by being there by any means. But you didn't sort of see them dig through like they might do a sawdust, or sort of roll in it or lay down. But to feel, it was very similar. Like for my hands to feel the two products, I couldn't necessarily discern why they would find one more different than the other and perhaps want to roll in one and not the other. So, I mean, yeah, like I said, that was just a anecdotal sort of observation. Yeah, like you said, like you alluded to, Sol, you'd have to probably see that in place, see the product in place for a lot longer to establish that thought. But that was probably the only behavioural change there might have been, if indeed it was, real. Yeah.
I've got a question from the chat line. It's about the aesthetics of it. Do you think that the darkness of it will put off people, or do you think people will get used to it being slightly darker than sawdust? Is it important at all?
I mean, it's just ingrained in us probably, Virginia, particularly that, that straw-coloured sawdust really gives that sort of impression of freshness and cleanliness. And, when you walk into a barn that's got newly laid sawdust, it looks lovely, it smells quite piney and it's all lovely. In saying that, it doesn't last that way for very long, with high traffic and the manure. I mean, the straw-coloured sawdust stains to be as dark as the compost material over time. Anyway, sorry, excuse me. So I think you're receiving a new product and it's dark, maybe something to get used to. But like I say, sawdust over time will degrade and look a very similar colour to that, and we obviously will replace that. But I think it will be an initial shock and changing how we view it, I guess. But I think it just basically centres around that idea of, if it's a lighter colour, it's cleaner. And for us, it's been the motive to change bedding is traditionally when sawdust sort of darkens in colour and it really breaks down, it becomes dusty. So, in some ways you can be feeling like, am I just putting like what looks like already an old product in for a new stable? But I think, like I said, that's just how we've been conditioned to think about it over time, and that's probably could change.
It's probably just something that needs to be addressed in the marketing or in the introduction of a stud to the material.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Another question here. Do you think the material is there any future improvements in the material that you'd like to see?
Look, it's hard to say, Virginia, because a lot of, like Sol pointed out, it performed very similarly to sawdust. So to say, oh, we want to improve it, well, where do you go? Because we've not really had anything better than sawdust. So aside from being able to muck itself out and change itself, I don't know what I don't really know what the improvements could be. You could say, that it never got dusty, but that just doesn't seem feasible. When you've got 500 kilos of horses trafficking around it, it's just going to break down. And in all the settings that it's in, it's covered, so it doesn't receive, even dew or anything to moisten it. So eventually, just the urine or feces isn't going to be enough to maintain a moisture content through it. So you're going to get sort of dust particles form as it degrades anyway. That's probably the main thing. If there was anything that I'd like to see improved, yeah.
Sounds like you're pretty satisfied with it.
But yeah, like on a whole, to work with, it was fine. I think the major thing is purely the colour. It performed very similarly to sawdust, and the longevity was similar for how it performed, and in the time it took to become dusty was very similar to sawdust. So in that respect, it's just like working with a slightly darker version of. Yeah.
Well, that's good. Yeah. Sol, do you want to finish with a couple of conclusions? We're nearly at time. There's a little bit more time for questions, and maybe Rob's got some questions that he might ask you too, Lisa. You want to just wrap up, Sol, with the conclusions, and we'll open the floor to questions.
Sure. Thanks, Virginia, and thanks, Lisa, for those conclusive statements. That's extremely positive. So I just have one last slide to. In conclusion, as Lisa alluded to, the findings of this trial demonstrated that there was very little change in the material's characteristics throughout the trial period. The material demonstrated that it can maintain its structure throughout the weaning season and handle a consistent traffic stream without disintegrating or banking. It did not break down or need to be replaced. The granular nature and variation in particle size meant that it made mucking easy and was lightweight in comparison to sawdust. The material was workable and dust-free, creating a safe working environment for the Crestfield staff and a safe and comfortable area for horses to bed or stable. From the anecdotal evidence received, the recycled organic material performed just as well, if not better than sawdust throughout this trial. The results of this trial indicated that the material can certainly work alongside or replace traditional bedding solutions such as sawdust. The overall outcomes of this trial proves that this particular product, made fit for purpose by ANL, can be used effectively as a substitute for traditional horse bedding. And thank you. Thank you all for your participation in this trial. Thanks, Lisa. It's been a pleasure to work with you. And thanks, Rob, for all your work and effort in this trial.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sol. Rob, have you got any further comments that you'd like to make?
Yeah, look, a little bit unlike me. I don't want to. I tend to be a positive kind of guy. I guess the comment that I would make is I wouldn't want the perception to go away that this is straight compost. It was the products that we came up with were really at the time a best guess based on what we knew about compost in terms of other applications around water and around odour and around, it's actually used, if you like to think in terms of odour, you have carbon filters or charcoal filters. Not that they're the same, but there is some similarity in terms of what they are likely to do in terms of, say, compost use. But, and it certainly brought some benefit, and there are aspects about it that things like sawdust just won't give you. There would be, I would caution though, there are composts and there are composts, and just how far you can go in that application. I mean, for me, we had horses growing up. I'm not silly enough to spend the money on them nowadays because they cost a fortune. However, so I've got a bit of knowledge about them. So in part, the idea was not to have something turn up that was black. It was interesting, Liesel's comments around that. That wasn't the intent. It was to try and give people a bit of an opening into this thing, not scare them off and not have a product that would fail. So I think there's certainly a distance to go. I think you can increase its use. So I'm moderately confident there. But I think people need to be really clear about what they were trying to achieve out of it. And I think I'm pretty confident there'll be points where too much is significantly too much. You'll start to damage the basic physical properties of the product that actually gives it. I'm really pleased with the comments that Liesel's made. There's a lot about that that's very positive. I think if you keep on going, you'll start to impact significantly on those benefits, I would think. But fantastic outcome. Really good outcome.
Yeah, excellent. Liesl, have you got any final comments that you'd like to make?
I guess just to sort of touch on what Rob said there, just to clarify, I think we're saying how far you go, you're saying, Rob, by increasing the percentage of compost that's in the blend, you'll get to a point where you're no longer seeing those benefits, whether you start to get, it does compact more or it's harder to move, or those benefits, the more percentage of compost. I'm not privy to how much what percentage of compost was in the blend that we received. I don't think we've ever known, and I don't know whether that's information that you want to give out or whatever, but certainly the blend that we received with the percentage of compost in it was quite workable. And I probably agree with you, there will be a point to which the addition of a greater percentage would no longer be workable. I would agree on that.
Great. Well, I think it's been a great outcome. It's a very untested territory, little bit of research from overseas, but I think we're on the road to finding a product that will be suitable to replace sawdust, because as Rob says, it's inevitable that sawdust will become less and less available and more expensive. And, the purpose of this project was to look at what other recycled organics materials might replace compost. Replace sawdust. And I think we're on that right path. So I'd like to thank you all for participating. Thank for everybody else online that's participated. And yeah, we'll record with this webinar's been recorded, and we'll make it available online for the participants as well as people that show interest after this date. So thank you all once again, particularly Liesl for all your time and effort. It's been fantastic. And Rob for all your insights into the material. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
See ya.